Hi, I'm Dr. Jean Fourie, and today I'm speaking about brain biology for teachers. This lecture will focus on the structures and their functions of our human brain. The brain is the most active energy consumer of the entire body. About 2% of our overall body weight is the brain, and it consumes 25% of the body's oxygen and about 70% of the glucose that is in our bodies. So we need lots of food in order to keep our brain functioning. The brain never actually rests, and its rate of metabolism is relatively constant day and night. So when you're asleep and dreaming, the brain's metabolic rate is actually increasing slightly as we are processing everything that has happened to us during the day. The brain is well protected by the skull, which is a bony a bone that is surrounding the brain, and it has various different parts. Beneath the brain are meninges, layers of very thick connective tissue that are in different layers with spaces in between them that are keeping the brain well protected. And it needs to be well protected because the brain is really made up of this very fine collection of neurons, and it's like a jelly-like structure, and it will be easily damaged if it was not well protected with lots of layers and a very good, thick, bony skull. So the brain, if you had a look at it from the outside, it's made up of lots of folds, and on the outer edge of this, the outer structure, is the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex, also known as the crown of the brain, are sheets of unmyelinated cells that form the outermost layer of the brain. It constitutes about 80% of the brain tissue and has these fissures or folds called gyrus, and they allow much more of this folding of the brain to be packed into a very small space. There is a central fissure which divides the cerebrum into front and rear halves, and the two sides of the brain are also divided. There is a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere with a large fissure running lengthwise across the top of the brain, dividing it into this left and right hemispheres. These two hemispheres are linked by the corpus callosum, which is a neural bridge consisting of white myelinated fibers or neurons that acts as a major communication link between the two hemispheres, allowing them to function as a single unit. So the concept of lateralization refers to the relatively greater localization of a particular function in one hemisphere or the other hemispheres. Generally, verbal abilities and speech are localized in the left hemisphere, as well as mathematical and logical abilities. So when the right hemisphere gets damaged, the clinical picture will be quite different Language functions are not quite as affected, but the person has great difficulty with spatial relations and spatial orientation. So it appears that in the right hemisphere, there is our mental imagery, musical artistic abilities, the ability to perceive and understand spatial relations. These are all primarily right hemisphere functions. But the idea that you are either left-brained or right-brained is a neural myth. You have to have both left and right hemispheres functioning together in order to do the complex tasks that we do as human beings. So if we go a bit deeper in and we open up the two hemispheres, we can see that there's a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. They are connected by this big set of fibers, the corpus callosum, and right inside the brain is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and at the back is the cerebellum, which then goes down into the spinal cord. And all the way down, the spinal cord has all the nerves that go down into our face and into our body, our arms, and all the way down to our legs. So this brain is the most amazing structure consisting of these two hemispheres. And if we look at the cerebral cortex, it consists of 4 lobes, and these 4 lobes have unique names because there are particular functions generally associated with each of the lobes. And within our brains, there are approximately 100 billion neurons. So these neurons are very, very small, and they are all functioning together and creating our minds and our thinking processes and the ability to imagine things and the world around us. So each of these cerebral lobes, the 4 lobes, is associated with some particular sensory or motor or speech or some kind of function. There are large areas in the brain that are also in the cerebral cortex that are not associated with sensory or motor functions, and they make up the association cortex. These are involved in mental processes such as your thought perceptions, memory, and perception, making sense of the world around us and the understanding what we are seeing. If we have a look, this is a side view of one of the hemispheres. The frontal lobe in this picture is pink, and there is the red area, which is the motor cortex. The somatosensory cortex, this has got to do with sensory, nerve sensing things. The parietal lobe, right at the back in green is the occipital lobe, and in the on the side, just behind where your ears are, is the temporal lobe. So these lobes all have a particular function that they are performing. If we look at the motor cortex is this little red area, and this is the part that is controlling the 600 or more muscles involved in our voluntary movements. So when we want to move your little toe, the instruction comes from the motor cortex. So it lies at the rear of the frontal lobes, and the nerves from the motor cortex go down to the medulla on each of the hemispheres, and they cross over so that there is a crossing. Your left hemisphere's motor cortex is controlling the muscles and the movement of your right side of your body, and the right hemisphere's motor cortex crosses over, the nerves cross over and control the left side of your body. The sensory cortex is that specific area of the cortex which is receiving sensory information from the nerves that are coming from eyes and ears and your mouth and taste. And there is a specific area in the cortex which receives these senses and makes sense of it. So the input is what in the brain where these are being made sense of, the sensations of heat and cold and touch and even balance, kinesthetics, body movements. These senses are all perceived and made sense of in unique areas in the brain. The parietal lobe, just behind the motor cortex, has a place that is perceiving the somatic senses of heat and touch and cold. The somatic sensory area is organized in an upside down fashion. So if you are wanting to feel or feel what is happening with your toe, it is not at the bottom of the brain, but it is at the top of the brain. So that's just an interesting thing to note. The senses of hearing and sight are very well represented in the cortex. The sense of hearing, the auditory area, lies in the temporal lobe on each side, so just behind your ear. The ear is sending messages into the brain, and they go into the temporal lobe, which then processes and makes sense of what you are hearing. For vision, your eyes perceive the light, and that goes through the eyes and then through into the visual sense, and that nerve of your eyes goes right to the back of the brain where the occipital lobe is situated. So each eye is sending input to both hemispheres. So the right eye is sending messages to the right occipital and to the left occipital hemispheres. Within each of the sensory areas, there are neurons that are responding to these particular sensory stimuli, and they are tuning in to your environment. So your brain is making sense. The sense of perception is making sense of what you are giving meaning to what you are perceiving in the world around you. There are two specific areas that are to do with your understanding and production of speech. And these are located in the left hemisphere. So if we look at the left hemisphere of the brain, there is an area called Wernicke's area, and this is in the temporal lobe. It is primarily involved with speech comprehension, with understanding the speech around us. Then in the Broca's area, in the frontal lobe, in this little picture, it's the blue part. The frontal lobe, the Broca's area, is mainly involved in the production of speech. So this has got to do with you saying things. And so the speech organs controlling the muscles of the mouth and the tongue are situated in this particular area over here. So those are highly specialized for language, which is what we are good at as human beings. So the frontal lobes, the pink areas of the brain, the frontal lobe is very well developed in humans. And this is said to be the site of all the qualities that allow us to have self-awareness. We are conscious of ourselves as beings. We are also able to plan things, take the initiative, do things, make buildings, build cities. And all of this is happening from this well-developed frontal lobe. We know that if there is brain damage to this area, it results in an inability to plan, to carry out sequential actions. And the frontal lobe is also greatly involved in our emotional experiences, in making sense of the emotions and the world of depressions and happiness and all the feelings that we feel on a daily basis. So this very forward part of the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, which is located just behind your forehead, is the seat of our executive functions. Executive functions have been called that. These are our mental abilities that allow us to do setting of goals, to make judgments, and to be strategic in our actions and planning. It's also the place that allows us to control our impulses and to direct our behaviors in an adaptive way so that we can function effectively in a very complex world. The association cortex is involved in the functions of perception, perceiving, understanding, making meaning of the world from our senses around us. So it is taking input in from the eyes and the ears and making sense of what's happening. It's also involved in language and thought and our ability to understand speech and to do complex thinking and complex problem solving. The association cortex comprises about 75% of the cerebral cortex, and this is what they think. Scientists think that this accounts for our human being superior cognitive abilities, our amazing ability of language and abstract thought, and our amazing imaginations that we have. If we think about another way of looking at the structures of the brain, traditionally we look at the three main subdivisions, and these are known as the forebrain, this orange part, the midbrain, the part right in the center in green, and the hind brain, which consists of the cerebellum and some other structures. So we'll go through those. The forebrain is considered the most evolutionary and advanced structure. It consists of the cerebrum, two large hemispheres, the left and the right, which are wrapped around the brain stem. And the outer portion of that is the cortex, which we have been speaking about. So within the brain are a number of important structures which are buried right in the central regions of the hemispheres. And in the the center is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pons and the medulla, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord are all part of the hind brain. So if we have a look at what's happening in the midbrain, this is the thalamus, and this is considered like a sensory switchboard. It is located just above the midbrain, and it resembles two small little balls, one in each of the hemispheres. It acts like a switchboard, organizing inputs from the sensory organs and routing them to the appropriate areas of the brain. So the visual, auditory, all the body senses, all of these come into the brain, and they have major relay stations in the thalamus, which sends the signals to the correct parts of the outer cortex to be processed and perceived and to be turned into memories. The hypothalamus, which is just under the thalamus, consists of a tiny group of neurons that lie at the base of the brain. They play a major role in all our aspects of emotion and motivation. And this has got to do with all the things that make us feeling and sensing human beings. They also have to do with motivation of sexual behavior, the regulation of our body temperature, our sleeping patterns, eating, drinking, and things like aggression as well. There are important connections in the hypothalamus with the endocrine system, and this is all the hormones that are in your body that are allowing us to function. So the main involvement of this is got to do with our experiences of pleasure and displeasure, and all our feelings are associated here. So we've got the thinking brain, which is the cerebral cortex, and the feeling brain, which is this part in the midbrain. There is also the limbic system in the brain. This is a structure deep within the cerebral hemispheres, and the limbic system is the coordinating part. Is coordinating all the behaviors needed to satisfy the motivational and emotional urges that are arising in the hypothalamus. So it's directing our behavior, and it is associated with all the emotions and with all the urges. So if you feel you need to sleep, or you feel hungry, or you are motivated to go and do something, this is the part that is directing these things. It's also involved in our memory, and the memory has got to do with the daily behaviors that we should be doing, and what you're going to eat, and all the functions of daily living. So these are all the structures in the right in the center, the thalamus and the hippocampus. These are all involved in the emotional regulation of what's happening in the brain. The hippocampus and the amygdala, they are involved in forming and retrieving our memories. So the amygdala organizes the motivational and emotional response patterns and particularly those patterns that are linked with any aggressive behaviors and any fears. So the amygdala is a key part of a larger control system for anger and fear, and also coordinates this with other parts of the brain. So there are interconnections with the hippocampus, and the amygdala is the stimulation for creation of these memories associated with all our emotional behaviors. Now we get to the hind brain, which is considered the lowest and most primitive level of the brain, and it is where the spinal cord comes from the spine and enlarges to form a stalk-like part called the brain stem, and the brain stem is attached to a major portion of the brain known, also part of the hind brain, which is known as the cerebellum. And it is the most primitive level because this is the part of the brain that controls all our life support systems. These are the structures of the brain that support vital life functions, and the medulla and the pons are crucial parts of this system. And the medulla is vital for keeping the actual body functioning. So this is controlling your respiration, your breathing. It's controlling the heart rate and your blood pressure. These are vital things that need to be functioning, and it is very well developed by the time a child is born, because you need to have heart and breathing in order to be alive. At this part of the brain, there is a two-way thoroughfare for all sensory and motor tracts, which are coming up from the spinal cord, and the motor tracts that are descending down from the brain. And it is at this part where a lot of these tracts or nerves will cross over in the medulla. So the left side of the brain is receiving sensory input from the right side of the body. The right side of the body receives sensory input from the left side. So there's a crossover here, and also the motor neurons cross over. So the right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere. The left side is controlled by the right hemisphere. In the hind brain is the pons as well. This is a little bridge. It lies just above the medulla, and it carries nerve impulses between the higher and the lower levels of the nervous system. This is a crucial part that helps to regulate sleep, and it also assists with functions like respiration. And so it is really, really well protected to keep us breathing and to keep us alive. The cerebellum, which lies at the base of the skull, is also known as the little brain. It is attached to the rear of the brain stem and consists mostly of gray matter, gray neural matter, and this part is concerned with muscular coordination. So it plays quite a large role in the coordination and the learning and memory of anything to do with muscular movements. It regulates our rapid movements. So if you are doing rapid moving like dancing or driving, and that require a large amount of body coordination and functions of muscles and senses to work together, it is being controlled in the cerebellum. And this part of the brain is very easily disrupted by alcohol, and alcohol causes coordination difficulties if there's excessive intake of alcohol. The midbrain lies just above the hindbrain and contains large clusters of sensory and motor neurons, and it's the relay center, relaying visual and auditory senses that are senses that are coming from the eyes and the ears. They are organized here and sent to the forebrain structures, which are then involved, the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, that are involved with making sense of the information that is received from the sensory neurons. So the midbrain also has the motor neurons in it that control your eye movements. Then there is a structure called the reticular formation, which looks like a net, and it acts as a kind of a gatekeeper of information. And this is gatekeeping information which is being allowed into the conscious mind. The reticular information both alerts the higher brain senses that messages are coming, and it may also block those messages and not allow them to go forward into the cortex of the brain, where they go into conscious thought. The ascending part of the reticular formation sends input to higher regions of the brain for this alerting function, and the descending part through which higher brain centers can either admit or block out sensory input. The reticular formation thus plays a central role in our awareness of our consciousness, in our ability to sleep and to have some time where the brain is processing information and our bodies are at rest, and also in our sense of attention and attending and concentrating to tasks that we need to concentrate on. We know that the brain is considered to be plastic. There is plasticity in the brain, and this is the ability for neurons to change, for the brain to be modified to a certain extent in the structure and the functioning. We are born not able to walk and talk, and slowly we build up the ability to walk, to do complex movements, to acquire speech. We have to learn how to read. We have to learn all about the emotional responses, and our brain changes every minute and every single time that we are experiencing anything. There is some alteration happening in the neural structures. This process of brain alteration or plasticity begins in the womb and continues throughout your life. Although some of our brain development is governed by genetic factors, it is also strongly influenced by our environment and the experiences that we are exposed to. Our experiences greatly influence our brain development. The brain is programmed by these thousands of complex commands from our genes that we inherit, but how these genes play out or how they express themselves is powerfully affected by the environment, by the stimulations which we receive in the environment, either the one we're exposed to from birth, but certainly the environment that we are born into. So the brain is constantly changing and adapting as it is being sculpted by our life experiences. And this plasticity is useful because it helps the brain to do any healing of the nervous system. So when any nerve tissue is destroyed out of the aging process, there are other neurons that can assist with restoring functioning by modifying themselves structurally or biochemically, and so take over functions that are damaged. So there is an alteration of structures by enlarging the networks of dendrites or by extending axons from surviving neurons to form new synaptic connections. And we know that there are new neurons produced in the nervous system by a process called neurogenesis, and that this process is assisting with all the learning and the experiences and the functioning that we are doing from the time that we are born, as we are developing and growing our complex neural systems. And the crucial thing for us as teachers is that we need to be actively doing things. We need to be touching, feeling, seeing, hearing, exposed to the worlds around us. We learn by doing. Our brains are being developed, their architecture, their structures, by hands-on interaction with the physical world, with the world around us that is stimulating us, that assists us to grow and to develop strong brains. So thank you very much for listening to that, and I hope that it will help you in your teaching to think about the brain developing, the developing brain of children, and how we are assisting as teachers in neural development.